Hi, everyone. Looks like we've got some people coming in. We'll wait just another minute while other people are filtering in and settling in. Thank you all for being here. I hope you're all having a great Tuesday. It's very nice here outside of Boston, and we'll enjoy it. Our days are numbered. We probably won't get snow until October, so that's good. Um, I see we have some people here from New Jersey, from Minnesota, Illinois, from all over the place. We're going to wait one more second and then I will go ahead and start. Okay, well, good afternoon. I am Alyssa Koff, and I'm the Senior Digital Marketing Manager here at ACUE. Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to be discussing deliberative dialogue, but first I want to just take care of a few housekeeping items. We are going to ask that you join the conversation. That would be great, but if you could put your questions in the Q&A section and put your comments in the chat, that would be very helpful. Um, and yeah, so that's right. So questions go in Q&A and the conversation goes in the chat. It's great to have so many members of the Belong community joining us in collaboration with the Council of Independent Colleges and ACUE today. Our topic is deliberative dialogue, which is a way to help students have thoughtful, respectful conversations about tricky and sometimes controversial issues. It's a skill that's more important than ever in this day and age. And I know that sometimes it can be, some of you can be hesitant to use it because it can feel hard to structure and facilitate these discussions. In this session, we've got a fantastic panel who will have strategies to um, help you overcome the challenges. They'll share real approaches. They'll talk honestly about common pitfalls and give you practical tips for bringing deliberative dialogue into your own classroom. Whether you're getting started or looking to level up your approach, you'll leave with ideas that you can use right away. So without further ado, on behalf of ACUE and CIC, I'll introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Lori Pendleton, who is the Executive Director of Faculty Success here at ACUE.
Thank you, Alyssa, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly important topic. And it seems like every day we hear something in the news and we think, you know what would really help that is if people just could learn how to sit down and have a conversation with each other and hear from each other and be able to share opinions and learn from each other by having a conversation. So I'm really thrilled to both bring you this webinar, but also the resource that we have to help support deliberative dialogue. And I'm joined by our panelists this afternoon. We are joined with, excuse me, Dr. Peter Felton, who is the professor of history and the executive director for the Center for Engaged Learning and assistant provost for teaching and learning at Elon University, a beautiful little university in North Carolina. I had the pleasure of going there. We spent a number of days and really enjoyed it. And we are also joined by Dr. Rosie Bolin, the director of Solidarity, Engagement, and Success Initiatives at Mount St. Mary's University. And I tell you, that is a title that all all of us are very interested in having. It sounds fantastic. So let's begin our conversation by really helping and working to understand what we mean by deliberative dialogue. And one way to think about it is to think about a continuum of discussions or conversations that we might have in the classroom or even out in the wild, sitting in a restaurant or talking with folks that we know. On one end, we have a conversation, which Graham Bullock really describes as wandering across the terrain. It's a little bit jumping from topic to topic. We may talk about the sports or weather, or politics, and we don't really have any rules or facilitators or even goals to that particular conversation. So that sort of fits in the bucket of conversations, and we have those often in our classrooms before class starts, after, have an opportunity to talk to students. A discussion really picks a spot on that terrain and focuses in on one subject. Might be something like abortion or immigration or any contentious question that might come up in your class. And it really maps out the positions on the landscape and really gets an understanding of what people think about that particular topic. Then we move into dialogue. And in a dialogue, we really start to dig and start mining for underlining reasons and stories and evidence about why people hold those positions. So that's where we start to think, why do you think that way? What position do you have? What's your thoughts about that? And what's your experience? Why do you believe in that? Then when we start getting into deliberative dialogue, we go one step further and really start to weigh what's being said, what evidence is being presented. What is the source of that evidence? So we don't just start digging around for meaning and what people might think. We really start to sift through it and compare and reflect on what we have learned together. So here's what I think, here's what they think, and here's what we think together. And it really sort of gives more focus on weighing that evidence and coming to not conclusions, but coming to a common understanding. And then on the very far side is really a debate. And a lot of folks say, well, isn't deliberative dialogue just like a debate? And really a debate typically has two sides, and oftentimes it sets up as there's a right and a wrong, there's a winner, there's a loser. We do share opinions and beliefs and evidence for a debate, but a deliberative dialogue is more conversational in nature and really sort of tries to get to underlying opinions and thoughts and beliefs. And really, one of the points of a deliberative dialogue is helping students understand what opinions they have, why they hold those opinions, and give them the opportunity to maybe change their beliefs, change their opinions, to think about it from another point of view. So when we think about deliberative dialogue, it's also known as any other number of conversations. When we first started doing the research for this work in deliberative dialogue, we had a lot of conversation about what might we call it. And these are just some samples of terminology that came up. Civic dialogue, civil discourse, facilitated dialogue, lots of different decisions or lots of different terms for what we call deliberative dialogue. And we stuck with deliberative dialogue. It worked for us. It was a conversation we had with the folks that gave us feedback on the resources that we created, and it seems to work. But as you go through this work, you may say, well, at our institution, we call this the Civil Discourse Center, or we have regular conversations or community conversations. At one institution, we heard it called that. What it's known as and what we call it, really what we're talking about is having these discussions, serious discussions that allow students to share their opinions, to hear from others, to dig deeply into the sources of information, that sort of thing. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter now, who's going to share why at this point in time, these skill sets are so important for students to develop. Peter?
Thanks, Laurie. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. As I've been thinking about this session, I've got to say the historian in me kicked in, because people always tend to think like now is the hardest time ever to do anything, or now is the most urgent time. And in graduate school and history, you learn everybody always thinks that all the time. And so I go back as a historian. This is a book that I've thought about a lot. I want to encourage you to take a look at it if you'd like. It's Danielle Allen's book, Talking to Strangers, Anxiety of Citizenship, Since Brown versus Board of Education. And Allen published that book more than 20 years ago. And what she says is not we should do deliberative dialogue, but she says fundamentally in this country, we need to learn to talk to strangers about things that are meaningful. Because if we don't, we are going to struggle to have a democracy. And I think she's right. And I think now is a particularly challenging time to have deliberative dialogues. We're living in polarized times. We all know that. And bubbled times where what we do is we get information that agrees with us, and we're in communities of people who think like us. And that's just reinforcing. I also think our political discourse right now is more about insults than ideas. So I think students come into our classrooms, into our institutions, without having models of what deliberative dialogue necessarily looks like. They know how to yell at people and they know how to feel shut down, but I'm not sure they know how to really engage deeply. And I also think right now, and there's plenty of evidence that suggests we're in a pretty low trust time in our society and low trust in higher education. And it's not just that students may not trust us or our institutions. I think fundamentally, they often don't trust each other. And so when we say, let's get into dialogue in this class, maybe they think I am fair-minded and credible and trustworthy, but they're not sure about their classmates. And that's really a problem for this. So to me, all of that argues for the importance and the urgency of deliberative dialogue. Not it's hard, so we shouldn't do it, but it's hard, so we need to do it. And to pick up on something Lori has said already, I think we need to think about doing it not only in individual courses, but across and beyond the curriculum, so students develop and get these skills and habits and mindsets in deeper ways. And I think the research suggests at least four things deliberative dialogues help at least four things emerge for students. One is there's academic outcomes for these, and that can come in disciplinary knowledge and skills if you're in a history course or a philosophy course or a medical ethics course or whatever it is. But it also can be sort of the core curriculum type goals of critical thinking, developing inquiry habits, curiosity, the capacity to do research. And one of my pet projects right now, thinking about intellectual humility and cultivating that as an academic skill. So there are these academic skills and knowledge that come from deliberative discourse. There's also relational skills that are really important, both in the classroom and in life. Things like learning to listen well, to speak clearly, to be patient in a conversation rather than jump to conclusions, to have some empathy, to learn how to build connections and recognize shared humanity, even if you disagree with people. All those sort of relational skills can be developed, should be developed, will be developed in deliberative discourse. Third, there's a set of civic things. Some of them are related to the things I've already talked about, academic and relational, but thinking about things like engaging productively with people who are different than you, as Danielle Allen argues for, to understand different perspectives, maybe even to problem solve together. And I think also there's civic skills in sort of humanizing people who disagree with each other. And you can learn that, you do learn that through deliberative dialogue. And then the last of the four I want to speak on just briefly is that I think there's mindsets that are developed too. So not just skills, not just habits, but you develop an orientation of listening and deliberating so that you can learn. Through deliberative dialogue, you start to say, what am I not seeing? What am I not understanding? Rather than immediately jumping to conclusions. I think deliberative dialogue practice, especially if you do it multiple times as a student, is also going to help you learn that just because you're in dialogue doesn't mean you have to give up your beliefs. Doesn't mean you end up in some sort of mushy middle. You can learn that sometimes this kind of exchange will help you understand why you believe what you believe. Sometimes it'll help you change your mind, but sometimes it'll lead you to be even more deeply committed to what you're committed to already. And so just these four things are all hard. They're also core to the mission of higher education, to what we say we do as students. So I think it's really important that we do these things. And we can do this. One way to do this, maybe the most effective way to do this, is to give students lots of practice, lots of scaffolding with deliberative dialogue. So that's what we're going to jump into now.
Thank you, Peter. And that is it's so true in this idea of giving students lots of practice. And one way to do that is to think as an instructor, how can I introduce it into my courses? As we were doing the research on civil discourse, deliberative dialogue, we heard from a lot of institutions that have a deliberative dialogue center, or they have events, or they have things, something is not going well. There was one institution we talked to where it's part of dorm life, where they have deliberative dialogues in dorms or civil conversations in dorms, those are all great experiences and great opportunities. What we're thinking is, how do we spread this so that as many students as possible have these opportunities multiple times to develop these skills, because they are skills, and skills take teaching, they take practice, they take learning, they take feedback. So how can we structure opportunities for students to engage often in deliberative dialogues throughout their 4 years that they're at an institution, so that they are able to build those skills and then can go out with those skills in hand? One of the ways to do that is to really kind of think about, how can we structure a deliberative dialogue so that we're not just saying, okay, everybody, let's talk about immigration. That could be a little tricky. So putting it more structure around it, and as educators, I know we like structure and organization. So we looked at a couple of different approaches to civil dialogue. One that we used quite a bit was Project Pericles, and they have this structure of approaching deliberative dialogue. They say, first, introduce the topic. So how do you get students interested and engaged in the topic? How does it fit into your current curriculum? So how do you have the opportunity to introduce the topic? Why is it important now? When we were filming in one of the deliberative dialogues that you'll be able to see when the quick studies, and that's a little foreshadowing for later in the session, you'll be able to learn about, is we had someone that teaches biology, that did, her topic was on the CRISPR gene theory and taking a look at that. Another one did something on AI. Someone else did something on removing Civil War statues. So lots of different topics. So introducing it to students. And then we set or revisit ground rules. So what are the ground rules that we're going to use to guide our conversation? And oftentimes those are called norms. Those are called ways of being. When I taught, I always called them ways of being in our classroom. This is just how we treat each other and how we respect each other. So whatever you call them, we set or revisit the ground rules. Then outline possible issues or stances. So if we're thinking about AI, you should never use it in college classes. It's really going to lead to the dumbing down of everyone if we rely on AI, or you should have free reign to it, or there should be some parameters around it. So what are some possible issues or stances? And then hold the discussion, which seems pretty straightforward. Rosie's going to talk a little bit more in detail about that. And then always debrief. How did we do as a class? How did we hold to our ground rules? What are some challenges that we had? What are some things that we should revisit? So this sort of debrief, it's not just debriefing the issue and the topic. What did we learn about that? What are the different the different opinions and pieces of information that we gained, but also how did we do as a class? And then there's this opportunity again to reflect and assess, where we ask students to reflect back on their role in the deliberative dialogue. And we assess as a class, how did we do? What are some things that we may want to work on next? So it's really, again, it goes back to this idea of we are building skill sets for students. And how do you teach a skill? You introduce it, you explain it, you have students practice it, and then you revisit and reflect on it. So it is really sort of that same approach in the deliberative dialogue. Excuse me. Now, we see, it seems like, well, okay, there are those steps. Those seem pretty easy. I'm ready to start. But we know that there are some challenges that can arise. In fact, when we interviewed both students and faculty about their steps, students often say, I'm afraid to share my opinion because I don't want to be canceled. I'm afraid I'm going to say something wrong. So that was what we heard from the students. And what we heard from faculty was, I'm afraid it's going to blow up. And then what do I do? So now let's talk a little bit about the challenges. And to do that, to get us started, we are going to do a little Menti poll. So in this, you can hold up your camera phone and snap the QR code, and that will take you to our Menti. Oh, back one. Forward a couple. There we go. Thank you. And that will take you to our Menti poll. And you can go ahead and enter a word. What is your greatest challenge or concern with deliberative dialogue? And just hit submit. Ooh, inappropriate comments. Yeah. Oh, silence, the dreaded silence. Yes. What if I ask a question and no one says anything? Being canceled. Yep, that's what we heard from the students. Boy, and anger, fear, and silence, those come up a lot. And I will turn it over to Rosie to have conversation about the challenges we sometimes face when we are trying to hold a deliberative dialogue.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm seeing a lot of themes in the word cloud, but I have to say that some of the text is so small, it's kind of hard to read. But as Laurie was saying, fear, anger, and silence are coming up a lot. Harmful comments, inappropriate comments, closed minds, microaggressions come up a couple of times, safety. Those are all things that we hear from students and from faculty as well. So there are concerns on both sides. It looks like, oh, comments are still coming in. Ooh, my face saying too much. Yeah, sometimes my face is like an open book.
I heard somebody say the other day that their face comes with subtitles.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you all for sharing. A lot of concerns there. Can we move on to the next slide, or is there anything else that you all wanted to comment on about the word cloud? Okay. Yeah, so we were talking before the webinar and came up with this list of challenges to deliberative dialogue. And I believe that most of these were shared in the word cloud. So it's nice to see we're all on the same page. So I think one of my biggest fears anyway is what to do when you have a hot moment, when you have a statement or actions in the room that lead to high emotions. maybe you get triggered, maybe one of your students gets triggered, and you feel less effective at facilitating in the moment. Related to hot moments, someone causing offense or being offended, students are worried about being vulnerable, and you might be worried about being vulnerable as well. It depends on the level of trust in the room. And then somebody said silence. And so we can call those cold moments, right? Where you ask a question and everybody just kind of sits there and nobody's willing to share. A common concern as well is when students share information that we know to be false. So what do we do when that happens? Both Laurie and you all mentioned the concern that the students have of being canceled. And I think one of the things in the word cloud too was getting blowback as a faculty member. So that could happen on the faculty side as well. Oh, I wasn't quite done. I'm not seeing the slide anymore, but I didn't see this in the word cloud, but I've had my own faculty tell me that what if we have this awful experience and it just sets the tone for the whole rest of the semester? So there's a concern about that. And then another challenge is just lack of experience on the faculty members' part and also on the students' part. We're used to sort of we're not used to having in-depth conversations about these topics where we really listen to the other side. We're used to just kind of being surface and polite. Another challenge is being as inclusive as possible so that everyone in the classroom gets a chance to be heard. Laurie or Peter, did you want to add any more challenges to our list before we start addressing how we can? Okay.
I think that's a hefty list.
It is a hefty list. You wonder why anybody ever does it. At this point, Peter and I are going to, if you could have the previous slide back up. I don't think we're going to do the Menti yet. Yeah, Peter and I will give you some strategies for dealing with some of these challenges. And this might be a good point to put in the chat the link to a Google folder that we put together that has a lot of resources about deliberative dialogue and about dealing with many of these challenges. So thank you, Jen, for putting that in the chat. I'll just start off by saying that in preparation, the preparation is key. When you're going to embark on this journey with your students, you want to do all the preparatory work to be able to do the steps that Laurie mentioned, but you also need to manage your expectations. So you can't expect to be perfect the first time. You can't expect to make everybody comfortable, right? Somebody might get uncomfortable, and actually that's probably a good thing. Discomfort is where our learning edge is. And also, you can't expect to change students' views overnight. In fact, it's in a debate where you're trying to change views. In a deliberative dialogue, you're trying for everyone to be heard and for the different viewpoints, people with different viewpoints, to hear each other and understand each other. One of the principles of constructive dialogue, that's another deliberative dialogue by another name, is to let go of winning. Okay, so that's really important. And also related to hot moments, you kind of want to know, you want to do some thinking ahead of time about what might trigger you, what might get you emotional or upset so that you are not going to be as effective at facilitating, and think of how you're going to handle that when it happens, because it will happen. There's a resource in the Google folder about emotional regulation skills and practices. And if you're not really sure how you would respond in a hot moment, reading that article will give you some tips about what to do in terms of pausing and practicing mindfulness and remembering your values and things like that. There's also a handout in there from the University of Michigan about how to handle hot moments, and I'll just share a couple of them, and then I'll invite Peter to to come in if you'd like to add anything. So when the moment happens, it's okay to pause. In fact, it's a good thing to pause. You want to decide, are you going to address this now? Are you going to address it with individual students later? Are you going to address it in the next class? Do you feel prepared to address it now? And ideally you would, but not. You can always say something like, I feel tensions are rising with this topic that comes up, and I would like for us to come back to it when I feel better prepared to facilitate. And so you could, and then of course you need to come back and do it the next time. Also in a hot moment, or with some of these other fears or challenges, it's good to remind students of the class discussion guidelines. It's your job to hold students to adhering to those guidelines. You can give students a chance to gather their thoughts too. You don't have to keep talking the whole time. You can pause and have students maybe write out what they're thinking. And that'll kind of change the energy and slow things down a little bit. Another idea is you can use index cards to have students write down ideas, and that way they can share them anonymously. And I think another important thing to do is when you have students in conflict, listen for shared ground so that you can help them, so that you can sort of cut down on the antagonism. Okay, so I hear this viewpoint and I hear that viewpoint, and what I think they have in common is this value. So you get some sort of shared ground there. I'll just say for cold moments, there are some structure is your friend here with cold moments. You can prepare ahead of time discussion questions for students to talk about in small groups. You could do a think, pair, share, or a write, pair, share, so students have a chance to practice their ideas before sharing them out to the group. It also helps to be vulnerable yourself if you feel comfortable to share from your own experience. I've had times where the room's just been silent, and then I start to share my experience on the issue or my perspective or some experience that I had about it. And it can be, if you're willing to be vulnerable, that signals that it's okay for students to do that as well. I'll stop there. And Peter, if there's anything you'd like to respond to or any of the others that you'd like to address.
Yeah, just a couple minutes. For me, first, I think everyone should just listen to Rosie. She's wise and experienced with this, and the Google Drive resources are great. So you don't have to make this up on your own. How about that? As the first bit of advice from me. And you probably have colleagues, I'm sure you have colleagues on your campus who have experience doing this and have some success in doing this, even with the same students you teach. So think about who are the resources and what are the models you can adapt and use. 3 other broad thoughts from me. One is build up to deliberative dialogue. I know, one of the things I've learned as a teacher is I spend a lot of time before the class thinking about the class, and I'm like ready to go on day one. My students don't. And so, I teach about race and religion and things like this in the United States. And so I might want to jump right into the juiciest of the things we can talk about on day one. That's probably a mistake. So think about how do you help them build up the skills and the confidence and the habits that are going to help them when we get to those harder, hotter moments. So I do a lot of paired work, paired discussion, because I find once students hear themselves say something out loud, they're like, oh, I could maybe say that to a large group. I have my students do some quick reflective writing that they're not going to share with anybody else. And I learned from a wonderful historian colleague, Mary Jo Festo, about collaborative perspective taking. So we have the whole class make an argument together and say, let's talk about this perspective on this. What's the best arguments from this perspective on something? And so we're not in any way having a debate then, we're just trying to inhabit one perspective there. So one thing is really build up to it, even if you're ready may not be. So second thing, and the conversation and the word cloud really got me thinking about this. And Rosie talked about this too. I'm going to use a different word but I read a book this summer that I really find very helpful called Mind Over Monsters by Sarah Rose Kavanaugh. I'll put it in the chat. And it's about mental health and students. But one of the points Kavanaugh makes that I think is really powerful is that she's a psychologist, that anxiety and excitement are essentially the same emotion, appraised differently, right? And one of the things I worry about with our fear, my fear of being like, I don't want to do anything hot in the classroom, but does that mean the class is lukewarm? I mean, like, who wants to be in a class that sounds boring to me? So how do we get the excitement of a dialogue and a real exchange, and try to minimize some of the fear and some of the harms that can come from it? But that's partly of how do I approach this, and how do I help my students learn to have the kind of appraisals about, I'm uncomfortable here, what do I do when I'm uncomfortable? Do I shut down, or do I say, let me stay with this for a little bit longer? So helping students think about appraisals. Kavanaugh's book's got a whole chapter on using various improv techniques to help students practice with things, yes and activities or other activities that are really helpful. And, our students come to us, they've struggled, they've done hard things before, and they've succeeded in them sometimes. So how do we help them build on that, notice that, and shape their appraisals? So maybe they're not experienced having a political conversation or disagreeing with someone. That's okay, we can help them build that muscle. And then the last thing I want to say as I close up is, as the faculty members in the room, we need to be responsible for this. One of the things that I know early in my career, somebody would say something and I would just do the deer in the headlights thing and be like, okay, moving on. And that's not okay. Everybody heard what happened. I may not have a good response right now, but I think, if nothing else, saying, wow, this got complicated, this got hard. A go-to I've learned is asking everybody to take a few minutes or a minute and just write down what they're thinking and what they're feeling right now, and give everybody a chance to breathe, including me, and think about what to do. But I think it's irresponsible for us to bring students into potentially hot moments, and then when we get uncomfortable, sort of backing away ourselves. If we're going to do it, when we do it, we've got to recognize we've got a responsibility to lead them through it, even if it's hard. But I again want to flip the appraisal, because one of the most powerful moments in my teaching career, and this was a long time ago, I was teaching a course about segregation in the United States, and I had a guest speaker. And the guest speaker just went after my students, who are mostly wealthy white students. This was at a different university. And the conversation got really quite heated among the students and the speaker. It was civil, but it was really heated. I was super uncomfortable as a professor trying to figure out what to do and everything. I went back to my office, and within 5 minutes, I had 2 emails. There were 11 students in the class. It was a senior seminar. It was 2 emails from students in class saying that was the best single class session I've ever had in college. And we had to do a whole bunch of debriefing afterwards, because not everybody felt that way. But just my panic at sort of losing control of the conversation, and the guest speaker asking students if they grew up in segregated neighborhoods, that made me super uncomfortable. I don't know if I'd do it today, but it was really interesting how students some of my students, actually a majority of my students, found that really exciting and challenging. So hot isn't necessarily bad. That's where I'll leave it.
Could I add just a few things? Do we have time to address some of the other fears? So Peter said, yes, we have a responsibility to respond when someone says something offensive or delivers a microaggression. There are some resources on microaggressions in the Google folder to help you learn to recognize them. There's a multi-page document with examples of what microaggressions that are classified by type by Daryl Wing Sue. And then I put together like 5 or 6 strategies to respond to microaggressions. And there's some classroom scenarios in there, so you can take those back and practice using the responses. For lack of experience, I want to put a shameless plug in for the Constructive Dialogue Institute's Perspectives program. It's a 6 30-minute modules that your students can complete that will help build the skills necessary for deliberative dialogue. And it's going to be pretty informative for you as a faculty member as well. And then I also want to point out that there, in terms of responding to incorrect information and hot moments and some of the other fears and concerns, there's a page in there of starter phrases that can give you some templated language to use when something hot comes up or when somebody shares something incorrect. So the workshops I give on this are usually an hour and a half long, so it's really hard to condense all of that material into the few minutes that we have here, but there's a lot of good stuff there in the Google folder.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Rosie said and add one quick thing, those resources are really, really helpful. So look at those again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The other thing I would say is build up some trustworthiness with your students and among your students as you're going in the class, so that when that hot thing comes, you're able to say, wow, I'm not quite sure what to do right now. That comment or something feels out of bounds, but let's do this, because we've already practiced this habit of reflecting or talking in pairs or et cetera, right? So that don't sort of anticipate that there's going to be hot moments and things coming, and build some skills around them. So you're sort of inoculating against that, which doesn't make it easy if something ugly happens in your class, but it means everybody in the room has some skill and some habit that they can fall back on, like journaling, like talking in pairs, something like that, that helps them process what they're thinking and feeling in that moment.
Let's see. Great, thank you so much. And Peter, I love this idea of practicing on sort of more, some easier topics. One of the folks that I interviewed said she always starts one of her classes with a debate or a dialogue on what's better, pancakes or waffles. And so it just helps students sort of get that out, and kind of sharing their opinion in sort of a more low stakes way. Absolutely. Thank you so much. So it is challenging and it can be hard, but as Peter said, we've all done hard things before and lived to tell about it. So, and it can be very exhilarating. It was a lot of fun watching as we were filming some deliberative dialogues. The students left saying, wow, that was great. That was fun. That was interesting. So there was a lot of fun, exciting conversation about that. But students do like that, and they're with you. They want to engage in these deep conversations. So they're with you. So what I'd like you to do now is to think about what are some things that you could do in your course, whatever subject it is that you teach. So what do you teach, and what conversations do you or could you have? So for example, you might teach elementary ed. I always taught elementary ed. Teaching and learning in the K-8 world, and one of the topics might be testing, mandatory testing, and what do we do with it? That's a controversial topic. That's a topic that a lot of students have an engagement and information with. So this is an opportunity for us to think a little bit about what you teach and what conversations do you or could you have that might be ripe for a deliberative dialogue. So go ahead and join. You've already joined the Menti, so it should show back up. If not, you can go to menti.com and put the code in. And while you're doing that, I'm going to drop in the chat the Project Pericles resources that have sample lessons and discussion guides for lots of different topics and lots of different subject areas. Why do different audiences react differently to the same work? Really interesting. Yeah. Oh, and there's a really interesting one in the chat. Oh, yeah, knowing only one language. Excellent. AI is a hot topic. And it was really interesting that in the conversation that I was overhearing, one of the things that really students sort of caught on to was the ethical considerations of using AI and how it takes work from other people and it uses large amounts of water. And they were really into that. And it was a lot of conversation that they hadn't had before. Great. Feel free to continue adding to those. Phones in classrooms, absolutely, yes. My local high school just gave every parent a heart attack by saying they're not allowing phones in high school in classrooms this year. Hot topic for everybody at this point. Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, we'll continue this. This will be up. You can continue adding to it. The next thing that I would like you to consider is it's always more fun when we do things together. So, what are some opportunities that you have to work with your colleagues to promote deliberative dialogue, and what are some next steps that you might take? And your colleagues might be in the same subject area, so we're going to have a conversation in our history department about how we bring deliberative dialogue into our first year all the way up to our seniors so that everybody has an opportunity to experience and learn skill sets associated with deliberative dialogue. Or it might be across subject areas, which is another really interesting way to have a conversation. Again, there's this idea of having one idea is to have students put together issue guides. So think about in biology, here's the topic we're going to have a deliberative dialogue on. And then in your English class, you're going to research that particular topic and put together an issue guide. And you're going to test the validity of the sources that you use. And you're going to make sure you're not relying on AI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and 3-class gen ed sequence would be a good place for this. Excellent. And that idea, Rosie had the perspectives. I'm going to drop that link in the chat too. That would be a nice resource for you to use with students. Department faculty meetings could model a deliberative dialogue in a faculty meeting. That would be an interesting. I've sat through some faculty meetings who've gotten a little heated or very cold. No one says anything and then they go out into the hallways and there's lots of conversation. So
Laura, if I can just add one thing to the value of departmental discussions here,
sure.
because I've encountered this in my own work where I get all psyched up to do this deliberative dialogue in a course about something that I think is going to be really hard for my students. And then they tell me they actually had a similar conversation last semester in the course before mine. And so, if we talk to each other, we could find out not only what are the skills and habits students are developing, but what are we talking about? And so that I could have had my students better build on what they had done before rather than just assume this is the first time they've ever encountered this idea.
Yeah. And think about the power of that. I know that last year in your History 101 class, you had this conversation. And now we're going to take that purposely a little bit deeper and talk about this point. Yeah. Powerful. Oh, my teachers are talking to each other. Imagine that. Fantastic. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Alyssa for some Q&A. Alyssa.
Hi. It looks like we have a great question here in the Q&A. It says, holding faculty accountable regarding addressing these issues in real time. Please elaborate what that looks like from your perspective. Maybe Rosie, you could start with that.
Sure. I don't know how, well, I can talk about tools for faculty to respond in real time, and those would be the strategies for responding to microaggressions and other bias comments. Those can be applied to all sorts of hot moments that happen in the classroom. In terms of how faculty themselves can be held accountable, you would hope that this skill in teaching would be valued by tenure and promotion and review committees, and that would be something that that faculty could talk about in their packets. And of course, if the conversation goes really bad, then perhaps the student would go to the department chair, and the department chair would then, I know that that's happened before, that the department chair could then have a conversation with the faculty member to hold them accountable. I'm not sure if that gets at what the question was. Peter, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Your answer is great. I would just say, first, I think we should hold ourselves individually accountable. Like if we're structuring and holding this deliberative dialogue, I don't get at that point when I get uncomfortable to back away from it. I need to stick with it, even if it's hard, which hasn't happened very often in my career, but does occasionally happen. And the other thing, as Rosie said, I think it's really important that if you're going to, when you do this work, find ways to bring it into your annual reviews and your tenure and promotion and saying, I'm asking my students to do hard things. I'm developing these skills. Does that sometimes show up in my teaching evaluations or other things? Is students sometimes saying, I was uncomfortable sometimes in class? Maybe the answer is yes, but sometimes that kind of discomfort can be okay if what we're doing is pushing students to really think and really engage in all this. And so, again, I worry that if we are so afraid of making anyone uncomfortable, we're not going to engage students very much either. And so trying to get the right kind of anxiety built up in class, which is, this is exciting, this is hard, I'm going to learn things, and then hold ourselves accountable for that.
And I think that can sort of be built into a self-reflection too from students. Let's have a, how did you feel during this conversation? What moments were you with the conversation? And at what times did you feel like you were at odds with the conversation, or you felt uncomfortable, or you wanted to say something and didn't, or you wanted to say something and you did, but you were worried. So that sort of self-reflection, both that's part of the deliberative dialogue, that's both a reflection of how we did as a group, but also how you did as an individual, can be pretty powerful.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question. Some of us live/work in states that are taking very aggressive approaches against anything considered woke or related to DEI, as they understand those terms. What advice do you have for negotiating this legal minefield?
I'm
Yeah,
not a lawyer, but my understanding, at least with the universities that have reached deals with the administration, that academic freedom has been somewhat protected, and the curriculum has been somewhat protected. I would be more concerned about like courageous conversations or deliberative dialogue that maybe this happening sponsored by like a Center for Student Diversity outside of the curriculum. So I'm interested in what you all think about that as well. But we've been telling our professors that they should just go ahead and teach how they normally teach. We are making other changes outside of the classroom, but to reduce our risk. But anyway.
If I can add, and I agree with Rosie in particular about well, about everything, but about if you have perspectives or ideas on this and you want to share them in the chat or experience, that could be really helpful. The one thing that I think we are smart to do as faculty as we engage with this work in more hostile climates for it or not, is actually to put more in writing. And I don't mean some sort of memo of anything like this, but if I'm going to give my students a complicated thing to do in class, having a set of slides or a handout, for example, that explains what it is and why we're doing it, and what we're hoping to come from, is actually helpful to my students. And it's a discipline for me to make sure I get this right. It's easier for me to just stand and chat in front of class, but I'll get it closer to right if I write it down. And then if someone challenges it, I can go to my dean or whoever and say, this is what we did in class. Here is the handout. This is surely within my academic freedom and appropriate in this course that I am teaching, right? And so, anyway, so I think that's a good practice in general, and it also helps students stay focused on what's most important, because if in my teaching, it can be easy for me to say, I'll spend 5 minutes describing the activity, and then we'll do it. A lot of students aren't going to hang for that whole 5 minutes and understand everything. But if I give them a couple paragraphs on a handout, they can go back to that as they're having this discussion, say, are we on task, aren't we, etc. So I don't want that to sound defensive, and I'm not saying like write a memo to yourself about what happened, but literally just be really clear about what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. And that will be good for you and your students, and also is a record you could draw on if you need to.
And I would just add the importance of thinking about the topic as well that you're using. I mean, you can't, what comes up in conversation depends on what where the students take it, but what topics you pick for your conversation depends often on where you sit in today's United States. All right. Thank you so much for participating in our deliberative dialogue. We do have some resources available to you. So coming live September 5th are the deliberative dialogue quick studies. If you can go to the next slide, Alyssa, that would be helpful. So in the Commons, there are quick studies. There are a series of 5 quick studies designed to help you understand what deliberative dialogues are, what deliberative dialogue is, and then how do you plan it? How do you integrate it into your course? How do you practice and prepare for deliberative dialogue? So instead of just jumping in, as Peter said, day one, let's get into a really tight conversation on something, it really is this idea of how do you prepare students for deliberative dialogue? How do you teach things like active listening and sharing an opinion and hearing opinion and listening back or sharing back to what you just heard for a student? So really equipping students for deliberative dialogue. How do you set community norms? How do you teach active listening? And how do you create those low stakes practice opportunities so that you're building students' confidence and their communication skills? Of course, that's going to look differently depending on how much experience your students have with deliberative dialogue, which goes back to our plug for working together as a team on deliberative dialogue. And then actually holding a deliberative dialogue, there are 2 quick studies on that. One is launching a deliberative dialogue. So applying this structured framework of introducing the dialogue, getting it started, providing multiple stances, looking at it in multiple ways, either you providing an issue guide for students to use or students creating their own. And then facilitating a deliberative dialogue. So guiding students through this facilitated structured discussion, addressing those challenges that Rosie and Peter talked about, and then also using debriefing strategies. So look out on September 5th for the deliberative dialogue quick studies going live. We'll provide more information on how to access these resources. Alyssa, back to you. Oh, you're on mute. Mhm.
Sure am. Sorry about that. Thank you everyone for coming today. It was such a great discussion. I know I learned a lot. I will be sending out an email, or you'll be getting an email from CIC with the link to this discussion and all of the different handouts that we've been putting in the chat. So stay tuned for that. And I hope you'll join us for our next webinar coming up. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Peter and
Bye.
Rosie, for sharing your ideas.
Thank
And thank you,
you, Peter and
Alyssa.
Rosie and
Thank you
Lauren.
all for
Thanks
joining
so much.
us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.